You know, living with you, it hasn't been easy. People see me, but they think of you. Now with all this going on, this is gonna be worse than ever.
It don't have to be.
No, sure it does.
Why? You got a lot going on, kid.
What, my last name? That's the reason I got a decent job. That's the reason why people deal with me in the first place. Now I start to get a little ahead. I start to get a little something for myself, and this happens. Now I'm asking you as a favor not to go through with this, okay? This is only gonna end up bad for you, and it's gonna end up bad for me.
You think I'm hurting you?
Yeah, in a way you are.
That's the last thing I ever wanted to do.
I know that's not what you want to do, but that's just the way that it is. Don't you care what people think? Doesn't it bother you that people are making you out to be a joke and that I'm going to be included in that? Do you think that's right? Do you?
You ain't gonna believe this, but you used to fit right here. I'd hold you up and say to your mother, this kid's gonna be the best kid in the world. This kid's gonna be somebody better than anybody ever knew. And you grew up good and wonderful. It was great just watching you every day. It was like a privilege. Then the time come for you to be your own man and take on the world, and you did. But somewhere along the line, you changed. You stopped being you. You let people stick a finger in your face and tell you you're no good. And when things got hard, you started looking for something to blame, like a big shadow. Let me tell you something you already know. The world ain't all sunshine and rainbows. It's a very mean and nasty place, and I don't care how tough you are, it will beat you to your knees and keep you there permanently if you let it. You, me, or nobody is gonna hit as hard as life. But it ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward. That's how winning is done. Now, if you know what you're worth, now go out and get what you're worth. But you gotta be willing to take the hits and not pointing fingers saying you ain't where you wanna be because of him or her or anybody. Cowards do that, and that ain't you. You're better than that. I'm always gonna love you no matter what. No matter what happens. You're my son, you're my blood. You're the best thing in my life. But until you start believing in yourself, you ain't gonna have a life. Don't forget to visit your mother.
The King's Hall podcasts exist to make self-ruled men who rule well and win the world.
Well, welcome to this episode of the King's Hall podcast. I am your host, Eric Kahn, joined by host number 2, the host with the most.
The most.
I don't even know.
Well, I'm Dan Burkholder.
Pastor Dan Burkholder, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
We are doing a unique thing. Brian, we're talking about fathers and fathers' voices. And Brian is actually being a father right now, which is kind of cool. He has welcomed another Sauvé into the world, him and his wife. And so, Dan, can you believe it? He's on paternity leave.
Yeah. He named his son Alfred Kingsley.
I realized that when I prayed for them on Sunday, I prayed for him as King Alfred the Great.
I don't think you said great. I think you just said King Alfred.
Okay.
But yeah.
Yes, but that's what I was thinking, King Alfred the Great.
Yeah.
What a base Chad name.
Who he's named after, so.
Fathers and naming, very important. Father's words, very important. But we do miss Brian.
Yeah, most of the time.
Most of the time. It's been a little lonely in the office.
Yeah, but he should be back next episode, so.
He's coming back. Don't you worry, people. So, Dan, we're talking about in this episode, we just listened to this clip of Sylvester Stallone. We're talking about how fathers' words can shape. And we're going to be doing a little bit of compare and contrast in the episode with how men are often spoken to in the church. Now, the Stallone clip we listened to really, I think, is a good picture of fatherly exhortation, right? It's direct, it's to the point, it's full of some hard truths. But ultimately, what it conveys to Rocky's son is, I'm for you. I love that piece at the end where he just said, I'm always going to love you, right? You're my son, you're my blood. But he also calls him to a higher standard, right? In the clip, he also tells him to go visit his mother.
Yeah.
Which is his mother's grave, by the way. Very sad.
Oh, that is sad.
Very sad. Adrian, remember from Rocky? You've seen the Rocky movies.
Of course I have.
Can you give us your best?
It's actually
Yo, Adrian.
Yo, Adrian.
Yes,
I don't know if I can do it. I've never actually tried.
That was pretty good. I kind of put you on the spot, but that was good.
I doubt Brian, by the way, has seen Rocky. Actually, I'm almost sure he hasn't seen any of the Rocky movies.
He would probably make some joke which would show that he didn't. He'd be like, "Oh, you mean Thor?" Be like, "No, Brian, Rocky." So, Dan, what I love about this picture of fatherhood is Rocky's really saying to his son, "Here's how you do it." You know, he gives him inspiration. He encourages him. Again, this is a good picture of how a father's words can and do shape their sons. But as I said, we also have a lot of fatherly voices speaking to men that convey something very different, right? Maybe the tone of how many men are spoken to in the church and in our culture today is, "You're an idiot. Let me tell you how stupid you are. Now man up." Now, I don't know about you, Dan, but I think a lot of the problem is men in our culture, when you say man up, do they know what you're talking about?
No, because the picture of masculinity is so obscured. I don't think that we have much of an idea what that phrase means, other than, I mean, stop complaining might be one of the things that actually means. But if you think through, growing up, I grew up in the late '80s, early '90s. I was in public school. The entire message was girl power. Girls can do it. Girls were the heroes, and boys just like, please sit down and stay still and stop. Here, have some Ritalin. Stay in your corner. And so what does man up mean in that situation? It means get out of the way.
Yes. Well, it's also interesting. It reminds me of, I think he's like a guy from Boston who has like these funny man up or be a man, I guess it is, the little clips.
Okay.
So he's like, don't let somebody else ruin your day for you. Ruin it yourself. Be a man.
Yeah.
They're actually like not helpful pieces of advice.
Yeah.
But it kind of gets to this confusion of what does that actually mean to be a man, to man up? I think in our day, we have to actually show people and teach people and encourage people what that picture, as you said, what that picture actually looks like.
In the picture, in the cold open where we listened to Rocky Balboa talking to his son, he gives that. He says very pointedly, this is what's happening. This is what you need to do. This is what you cannot do. You can't use excuses. And by the way, you can do it, and I'm for you.
Right. Yeah, and then calling him up to that picture that he's laid out. Now, it's also interesting, Michael Foster has addressed this very similar thing in a lot of his content with It's Good to Be a Man. Right? On the one hand, you have the Mark Driscolls and the Matt Chandlers who took serious shots at men during their preaching ministries, but often it did not come across as those guys were in your corner. It was, I think, the equivalent, as we'll see in just a minute, of like the angry dad rant. Mm-hmm. Like, you guys are a bunch of idiots. And again, I think a whole generation of pastors has grown up with this man up phrase, which is like an empty platitude. It didn't actually mean anything, but it rings in many people's ears, even though well-intentioned, as a lot of people use it. It rings in a lot of people's ears as sort of an empty Nike phrase, like, just do it. And a lot of guys are saying, well, just do what? And then, the obvious question would be, how do I do that? So, Dan, I want to, as we talk about fatherly words, I want to contrast this with a very famous rant from Mark Driscoll, which we're going to play. We'll listen to it, and then I'll get your feedback.
Some of you guys, it's so frustrating. Some of you guys have been coming here for years. You still got your hands all over your girlfriend. Some of you guys have been coming here for years. You're still not praying with your wife. Some of you guys have been coming here for years. You're still single and having sex. Some of you guys will even as I'm preaching the sermon, some of you will be sitting next to your girlfriend or your fiance or your wife. Some of you guys have already given her that look. Don't cry, Don't let them know they're talking about me. Just hold it together. You've already intimidated her right here. Some of you guys have already whispered in her ear. I don't want to hear it. We're not talking about this in the car on the way home. Some of you have already whispered in her ear. I'm sorry, I'll do better. Trust me. Let's just move on real quickly. How dare you? Who in the hell do you think you are? Abusing a woman, neglecting a woman, being a coward, a fool, being like your father, Adam. Who do you think you are? You are not God. You are just a man. You're not an impressive man. You're not a responsible man. You're not a noble man. You're not a respectable man. You're not a responsible man in any regard. I don't care how successful you are. In this area, if you are a failure, it clouds all of your dignity. It robs all of your masculinity. There is no excuse for any man who claims the name of Christ to treat a woman in a dishonorable, disrespectful way. Some of you right now, you guys will get all angry. Oh, how dare he yell at me? That's the Holy Spirit telling you, it's you.
It's you.
I didn't name you. He did. You change now, little boy. You change right now. You shut up. You put your pants on. You get a job. You grow up. And maybe one day you can love a woman. It's for men, not for boys. And those of you men who are here and your wives are suffering under your folly and failure, shame on you. And shame on you if you say you're a Christian. And shame on you if you've been attending Mars Hill. And shame on you if you've been surrounded by good men and have pursued none of them. And shame on you if you've not become a member and submitted to spiritual authority. And shame on you if you've not joined a community group so you can walk in darkness. And shame on you if you show up to put communion in your hands, representing the body and blood of your murdered Savior, and then go put them on your girlfriend or download porn from the internet or raise your hand in a threat to your wife. Shame on you.
Okay, well, that was encouraging. A little, Dan, a little different than the Rocky Balboa clip.
Yeah, it did have a little bit of a different ring to it, didn't it? Kind of hits different.
It hits very different. So I want to get your take. The first thing I noticed was it was very demeaning and derogatory toward men. Now, it did sound like Mark probably was going, this is my pastoral read. He had probably been dealing with some men in pastoral counseling that had teed him off.
Mm-hmm.
And he was seeing a trend. And certainly it's bad if you're abusing your girlfriend.
Yes.
But I think the insinuation in that video is like all men are like abusive idiots.
Mm-hmm.
Like when he said, he was like, listen here, little boy. I was like, dude, if a bro talked to me like that, I would lose respect immediately.
Yeah, absolutely.
The way he concluded was really interesting. The clip obviously goes on. But the way he concluded was with like 27, like, woe to you, shame on you.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just want to get your take. Did you find that encouraging? Do you think men would be encouraged by that? Was it uplifting? Did you walk away saying, yeah, you know what, Mark's right. I want to do a better job.
Yeah. You know, it's so funny when you're listening to it. I knew we were going to play it, obviously, and I listened to it ahead of time, and so I knew what to expect. And we've all heard it to some degree, even if we've heard it in contexts that were not particularly helpful to masculinity, alluding to a different podcast. If you know, you know.
You know.
So here's the thing. As I listen to it, even me, I'm like, ugh, that's really degrading and really insulting.
Yes.
And I'm kind of mad.
Yes.
And I'm not like mistreating my wife.
I guess that was the Holy Spirit working in your heart.
I guess he named me.
Well, this is the other thing is like Mark had this way, like this is probably Mark at his worst, I think. Well, maybe like stripper pole Mark is probably worse. But this is one of those moments where you're like, Mark, okay, maybe you're just being a jerk in your sermon, but no, it's the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
How do you argue with that?
Exactly. It's a master manipulator. So I think a lot of the content in that message was necessary. Okay. Delivery, is obviously very powerful. Here we are still talking about how many years ago did he deliver that
It's a long time ago. You can tell by how bad the video is and even the sound
His
quality.
hairstyle and
yes.
yeah, all of it is very old. And so we're still talking about it.
Mark actually didn't have a ball cap like he does now in his sermons because I think he actually had hair.
Oh, that's right. He does preach with a hat on, doesn't
Yeah,
he?
he like has this like
Major cringe.
trucker blue collar vibe now.
Uh-huh. Arizona cowboy kind of thing.
Yeah, with a ball cap.
Yeah. Anyway, so master manipulators, I was going to say, they will often use tactics like, oh, you feel convicted? That's the Holy Spirit. Oh, how dare you confront me with this thing? God called me to do it. Like, what are you supposed to say to that?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, no, God told me. God called me to call you, that you're not called to do this calling. Like there is just it's a manipulation tactic.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I mean, after listening to it, it's just an absolute like gut punch over and over and over. And by the way, entirely unhelpful in a context of a sermon to a mixed, crowd. It would even be one thing if this was at a men's specific event.
He did also, if you listen to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, I believe there's a recording, I think, of a very similar vibe in like speaking to the men.
Yeah.
This was his whole like William Wallace II or whatever,
Yeah.
where he had like the pseudonym in their chat groups and he would blast people and say really racy things. So on the one hand, I think we could understand why Mark maybe was upset. Clearly had some young men in his church and his congregation from rough backgrounds in Seattle.
Yeah, they're in Seattle. I mean, that's like the pit of hell. So
Yeah, so he's addressing some of those things. But I also want to ask you, Dan, why again, getting into some of this, why is it unhelpful? It reminded me of Doug Wilson in Future Men. One of the masculine tendencies is for men to get angry. This is why so often in Scripture they're warned against it, right? Don't be angry. One thing Doug says in Future Men I found really helpful is when you're a father, he said, don't get angry, teach. Don't get angry, teach. So when I'm parenting my sons, I have to be reminded continually, you want to do the Mark thing and fly off the handle and just lose it. But it's not actually helpful from a fathering perspective. So I just want to get your thoughts on that. Why is losing your temper in the way that now Mark was probably, this kind of feels like an act to me.
well, he did it for like all of their sermons. There was they had services. Like they had 6 services or something crazy like that. I don't remember the exact number. But he did it for every single one.
Really?
Yes.
So
it wasn't like in the moment, like I'm really mad and I'm just going to lose it.
Yeah.
It was a contrived thing ahead of time.
Yeah, for sure.
From what I understand.
Yeah. So why do you find this so unhelpful? Why is that an unhelpful? It's unhelpful as a model for fathers, particularly with sons. Why?
Yeah. So it's interesting in Ephesians chapter 6. It says, fathers, this is verse 4, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. If anything, that clip makes me angry.
Right. It provokes.
It provokes. Yeah. He even says, like, if you are provoked, that's the Holy Spirit. A church father now saying this. So, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So, don't get angry, teach. I mean, that's what Paul is saying in this passage.
Yes.
Don't get angry, teach. Yeah, bring them up in the discipline of the Lord, discipline and instruction of the Lord. And so, I mean, I find this to be incredibly unhelpful. At the same time, like, listen, I'm not the tone police. It's like there's something really, really important and masculine about direct talk.
Mm-hmm.
But this is why we contrasted it with the Rocky clip, is because I don't think anybody can say in that clip that Rocky was pulling punches, that he was being too soft. No, he was laying it out straight.
And he even gets a little heated in the one part of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the difference is Rocky closes with, listen, I'm for you. You're my blood. You're my son. I'll always love you. Mark closes with shame on you. Like
yeah.
20 times.
Well, and there's teaching involved,
Yes.
right? And the whole thing is instructive from Rocky in this pretend, speech that he gave. But yeah, with Mark, it incites anger. It is a great way to lose, like you said, respect and to lose the hearts of the young men.
Yes.
There's another thing in there that we were talking about offline before this, is that it highlights bad pastoring in the church, bad fathering in the church as well.
How do you mean?
Well, because he says, quote, "You've been coming here for years and your hands are still all over your girlfriend. You've been coming here for years and you're single and you're still having sex. You've been coming here for years and you still raise your hand against your wife." What in the world is going on in that church?
Right.
Like, how has there not been a meeting? And maybe there's been many meetings and it was running rampant. I don't know. I don't know. But how can you allow those things to happen for years and not have church discipline? Church discipline doesn't take years. It takes time, but it doesn't take years to have somebody who's a serial fornicator or a wife beater or someone like that to go under church discipline. Like, the thing is, like, sin is like yeast. It multiplies, right? And so you have to squash that in the church really quickly to put out the sin amongst you, because it spreads. And so, I mean, quite honestly, what this highlights to me is bad fathering in the church. Church fathers, I mean, pastors, are operating in that way, that they've allowed the sins to run rampant.
Well, and that's actually a good parallel to parenting. I've found this multiple times in my own life. Maybe you're really busy at work for a season, you're really preoccupied, you're on your phone at night, your kids are fighting, whatever. You watch something happen for like a week, and then you just lose it as a dad. What's wrong with you people? Don't you know? Blah, blah, blah. Kind of Mark fashion. But really what it reveals is that, well, you haven't been faithful and consistent in fathering that whole time, and then you blew up.
Right, and then your children emulate that behavior then as well, where
Right.
they blow up.
Right. And so that's the other question I want to ask you about this. Mark's also, he's saying, all these issues with the young guys, but he's also modeling to all the men in the church how to father.
Yes.
Why in my mind, I'm thinking, is that so problematic? Well, I'm thinking about Ed Friedman's book. Again, Michael Foster, Rich Lusk have talked about this. Really helpful book. It's called The Failure of Nerve. And it talks about how leadership is fundamentally about presence, a calm, steady, gravitas presence. And so what he talks a lot about in the book is that when situations are really tense and really tough, you need to be the irenic guy. So when your son comes home and he's mouthing off to mom, which you'll find gets complicated when they're teenage sons, it's really helpful just to stand in between them, like your physical presence, stand in between them. And then you say to your son, "Son, is that the way that we talk to our mother?" Like, you don't flip out. So I started practicing this. Michael had recommended it. He's modeled it, whatever. And it's amazingly effective, because what you actually want to do is turn the temperature down.
So wait a minute. So when your kids would never do this, but when a teenage boy gets mouthy with mom, you don't walk in there and say, "Who the hell do you think you are to talk to your mother this way?
Shame on you!
You've been my son for years, and you talk to your mother this way? Little boy, go put your pants on, get a job."
No. In fact, and there have been times sinfully, I've repented of them to my wife and to my sons, where I've lost my temper. I'm sure many dads could identify with that. But I'd also seen it in counseling sessions in past ministries where, like, dads and teenage sons were getting into, like, shoving, pushing, hitting matches.
Dad better win. That's all I'm going to say. If you're going to fight with your son, you better win.
But looking at that.
That was a joke, by the way.
It's a joke. But yeah, you're looking at that and you're like, that's really unhelpful. It's unproductive. It's a way to provoke anger.
Yes, absolutely.
And again, you can take these and apply to different fatherly type roles in the church. You can take it to your workplace. Somebody comes in and they're really, ticked off at what's going on in the office. And you say, "Interesting. It sounds like you're really upset. Let's talk about this." Maybe list out your 5 top complaints. Let's go through them. I've had bosses who did this with me. You're really fired up. and they're just irenic and patient and calm. So I guess my point in all of this, this responding in anger and then modeling that for the children or modeling it for your congregation, I think it's actually counterproductive.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, it's counterproductive. I mean, you're like you said, you're giving men a model then in which to father their sons and to speak to other men as well.
Just be like
this is how you talk to guys.
Freaking out at guys.
Yeah, I mean, because what is happening is you have a student-teacher relationship. And so when a student is fully mature, he becomes like his teacher. And so, I mean, that's what you should expect then, is actually more of what Mark is yelling at instead of less.
Yeah, and we know from the fruit of the ministry, obviously it was like typified, the failure of the ministry was typified by like controlling and angry men, i.e. Mark.
Yeah.
And then the whole thing kind of detonates. The other question I have in all this, though, Dan, is we compare and contrast this to something we've discussed in the past, in past episodes with the OnlyFans. In that episode, we played a Matt Chandler clip when he was talking to men, but then also Jesus Wants the Rose, talking to the ladies. Do you find that Matt Chandler addresses, and Mark is really the same here, do you find that he addresses the sins of women in that same manner as he did with men?
No. Actually, it was interesting. I was looking for another clip. I figured we probably have enough. There was a clip of Matt Chandler, and he's talking to women, and it's in a men's series, by the way. And he was saying, women, you need to raise the standard. You need to raise the bar when you're looking for a man. Like, you can't just have a low standard. And I mean, obviously all this is true, but he's essentially saying, don't settle for these worthless guys. You are too valuable. You are too important. Do not settle for a worthless man. And all that I can say, yes. But knowing that on the other side, he's not saying now to men, do not settle for the loose woman. Do not settle for the woman with syphilis. Do not settle for the immodest woman, the loud woman, the brash woman, the woman who wants a teaching ministry.
Whoa,
Do not settle for that.
Dan.
You are too valuable to give your strength away to women.
Jesus Wants the Rose.
Well, he does, but he also wants you to not be a whore.
Yeah, Jesus. That's true. Both things are true.
Was I not supposed to say that?
No, that's right.
Okay, all right.
Jesus wants you not to be a whore. And I think also...
We're going King James Version.
Yeah, KJV. That's right. But I think also it will produce a certain kind of fruit in your congregation. This is where I think complementarian theology fits so well in these circles, is you're always going hard at the men. Little boy, shameful, you're a joke, who the hell do you think you are? In that same sermon, Mark is really talking about women in a way like, they're like this heroic princess in a tower and you have defiled them. Let's be real. I've counseled women from these broken Seattle type situations.
Mm-hmm.
The women ain't no cakewalk, my friend. Like usually in abusive relationships, it's like they have a lot of dysfunction that goes to both parties and it both needs to be addressed fairly, even-handedly, etc. But I think you're going to produce a certain kind of fruit in your congregation long-term when you're always, the consistent message is, men, you guys are idiots. Women have high standards because you are just slay queen. You are so wonderful in every way. So let me ask you this. What do you think the long-term fruit in, say, like a marriage is going to be when you have that dynamic going on?
Well, yeah. So what that sort of teaching does is it encourages the natural sins that will occur in the grain of each person in the marriage, within the grain of your sex, right? It encourages men, as you get beat down, to abdicate or to dominate, right? Because so the response from men, the temptation of the response from men with teaching like that is to either shrink back and say, you're right, I am a piece of garbage. You're right, I am a little boy. You're right, I am nothing of value. And my wife, she's a goddess. Like she is.
Even, do you remember that part of this Chandler sermon last week where he was like, men, when you come home, I want you to get on your knees and you serve that woman and you check her heart and you see how mama's doing. And I was just like, oh.
Yeah, so you have one where that's abdication, right? That's abdication. It's emasculating. It's abdication. And then you have the other ditch, which is I will then emulate that sort of teaching, and I'm going to then turn that onto my family, and I'm going to yell and lose my self-control, and I'm going to become like this man, right? And so I'm going to be really yelly, really angry. I'm going to be a tyrant. Okay, so that's the masculine side. The feminine sins are going to be like, how many times do you have to hear that you're valuable? You are, I mean, your biggest sin is that you don't think highly enough of yourself. Like your self-confidence is too low. You need to really like look at your inner feminine and really ascend to the heights, of your feminine glory. You're going to think that, yeah, you're right. My desire will be for my husband. I am in control. Like I can lead my husband around by this hook because pastor said he's a little boy. Pastor said he's not taking responsibility. Pastor said that he's just a boy who shaves. But I do not have those issues. I mean, I can't think of a single sin. Like that's going to be the nature of this relationship. And some people might be tempted to say like, well, that's a straw man. Except that actually does happen. And we've seen it exist.
We play these clips, I think, because it's a way of showing the receipts, but helping people also understand this stuff really has been going on for a long time. These are not new clips.
Mm-hmm.
It's going on a long time. These are, by the way, these are complementarian sermons.
Yes.
That is the thing to highlight too.
Yeah.
I think what the long-term net effect I've seen in marriages, like marriage counseling, this type of preaching really puts the woman in the driver's seat of the relationship.
Yes.
It neuters the guy.
Mm-hmm.
So that he really never has a leg to stand on in terms of actually taking lead in the relationship,
Mm-hmm.
because it's fundamentally taking the view of like men are the abusers, women are the victims, and that's how you need to view the hierarchy of your marriage.
Yeah. And one other thing that happens when men abdicate is that the married relationship becomes almost like mother-son.
Mm-hmm.
Which sounds really weird, and it is really weird. But that's what happens when a man abdicates, and then and fully identifies with being the man who is full of shame and doesn't have a leg to stand on. There is nothing to be called up to other than just like, don't taint your glorious wife, And then it ends up like he has to go to her for permission. Can I buy this thing? Can we do this thing? Should we do, should I take this job? Whatever. And it becomes like a mother-son relationship, which is very, very problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. Great book on this, by the way. I think it's Dr. Robert Glover, but No More Mr. Nice Guy. Kind of like why the nice guy thing always backfires.
Interesting.
It's like a secular view, but it's basically describing why complementarianism doesn't work. So helpful if people want to check that out. Dan, what I want to do now at this point in the show is kind of move on to the positive and the negative of looking at ways of how a father's voice in the home shapes the home, right? So father's voice is very powerful. Brian mentioned a statistic. I've seen this in a number of places where really there is undue weight in God's order. Like the father just has a very massive, weighty influence on the home, whether his presence is there, whether he's involved. But also we're going to be talking about now his voice. So one of the things to consider in all this is Proverbs 18:21. Proverbs 18:21 says, "Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and they that love it shall eat the fruit thereof." So Dan, first of all, this is just a very powerful statement. In the words of your mouth, you can kill or you can give life. So when you think about the fatherly roles, this is very weighty. And I think especially for us, fathers in the church, it's very weighty because the things that we say either kill or give life.
Yes.
It's also interesting in this verse that Solomon doesn't say words sometimes kill, they sometimes give life, and sometimes they're kind of neutral, right? There's really no middle ground here. It's very binary in the way that he describes this.
Yeah.
So I think a good question, fathers, as we begin this conversation, you can ask yourselves, what are my words doing in the home? Evaluate the individual words as you go through your day. Maybe even just take stock. Conversations, interactions in your home. What did I say? Is that life-giving or is that killing? When I think I've mentioned this before, at least on the Hard Men podcast, but it might be small things. When you come home and your wife says, you say to your wife, as I do every night, "What's for dinner?" And she goes, oh, we're
Do you really?
Every night.
Oh,
I say,
that's funny.
hey, what's for dinner? And she says, we're having this. And I go, past mistakes, hopefully I've corrected these, but in the past I would say like, oh, do you have this side? And she'd go, no. And I go, oh, well, that's a bummer. Okay.
What a turd.
Newsflash, that was
That's
bad
wrong.
move. That was a dumb, bad move. But that is a way that you're actually killing. Like your wife spent this time cooking a meal, serving the family, and all you did was complain about it. So did you kill or did you give life? Ultimately, like discouragement I would put on the spectrum of killing.
Yeah. I walk in the door and I say, sweetie, where are my children and what have they destroyed?
Yes. I've also, are they all alive?
Are they all alive? Yeah.
Does anyone
Well,
need to go
I
to the
mean,
hospital?
yeah.
Are they in good shape?
I've done story time before on this podcast, and I don't want my children to take it away from me, but let's just say they are bent on hurting themselves.
Yes, children are indeed crazy. So anyway, I think this is a good way for us to evaluate it. The other thing I want to tie this to, though, is the example of Christ. So when you think about Jesus' ministry, he had, the original 12 disciples. There's more disciples than that, but his inner circle of 12. And what you find throughout, particularly like Mark's gospel, Jesus is continually dealing with stubborn, hard-hearted, unbelieving men with failures. But it's so instructive the way that he deals with his men. He's the older brother. He's the leader of those men. He's continually teaching, encouraging them. He's reminding them of their mission. He's using parables. He sets children before them. He models the right form of leadership. You never see Jesus just absolutely lose it. You never see Jesus saying to the disciples who do some really foolish things. Jesus is teaching on the cross, Mark chapter 10, and going to the cross. And his disciples immediately begin fighting over who is the greatest among them. Like they have colossally, as bad as you could, missed the point of what he's teaching them. And what does Jesus do? Who in the hell do you think you are? What's wrong with you people? No. He's like, guys, listen, come here, come closer. You're not getting me. And then he teaches. So I think Jesus is perhaps the perfect example of don't get angry, teach. You also see, like with Peter and John at the end of John's gospel, Jesus, after everything that's happened, Peter's betrayed him, doesn't rub it in his face, 3 times confirms him. Feed my sheep. Peter, come. Like, I got work for you. I got a mission. I believe in you. You can do this. You can do this. And by the way, I don't know if Peter had a weightier mission than any mission given in the history of the world.
Yeah.
Outside of Jesus himself. But I'm talking post-Christ. Like, the weight of the church rests on what the work you're going to do. I would have been terrified.
Mm-hmm.
And yet Jesus is there confirming him, eventually filling them with the Spirit, giving them the tools they need. So I think this is a good fatherly type of picture of how we ought to treat our men. So Dan, I just want to get your response to that.
I mean, that is a really encouraging example. I hadn't really made that connection for the show because I'm so in the weeds as far as examples of fathers, but the words of Christ and specifically how he's speaking to his disciples, that is a really interesting connection, even to where there's a delineation with outsiders. Mm-hmm. And he's like, no. Let me explain the parable to you. I speak to them so they don't understand, but not to you. I'll speak plainly to you.
Yes.
And he brings them together, and then he instructs them and teaches them. And even when he rebukes them, there's restoration, right? Get behind me, Satan. But then all of a sudden, there's restoration and alignment with the vision of the Father.
Yes.
And that's constantly what it's coming back to. It is even in the most direct rebukes, there's no question Jesus is for them. And it wants to bring them in alignment. Yes. And is instructing them and bringing them along and is in their corner. Yeah, so that's a really good connection.
Yeah, one of the things I learned from an older pastor that was really helpful when you have these heated situations, I find I have them they're more difficult when it's teenage sons. If you've got a son who's just being obstinate, you're dealing with attitudes, whatever it is. But I learned this from an older pastor. And so what I'll do a lot of times, they're kind of being turds. And I will walk up to them and I will hug them and I will hold them and I will kiss them. And I say, son, I love you dearly. And then, well, we're going to talk. Ironically, we're going to have a conversation. But I think even those things of like disarming, I know a lot of grown men, that would seem like a weird thing. Kiss your son on the cheek, kiss him on the neck, tell him how much you love him. But it really does disarm and it changes the temperature. Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things with our words as men, we got to be aware of is your words are like a thermostat, right? What are you saying, which is a reflection of your heart? And that's going to change the dynamic of the home. And one of the biggest temptations is something irritates you, you fly off the handle, or in that moment you say, okay, I need to actively, intentionally turn down the temperature.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean,
I'm
that's
working
really wise.
in the opposite direction.
Yeah. I mean, you've seen this in like basic conflict resolution or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's especially true for being a father. When things start to get heated, turn the temperature down. You speak with a slow, calm voice. Remain self-controlled.
Focus on body posture.
Mm-hmm.
You know, even if I found this in counseling, like if you're sitting there and somebody's really angry, if you can even sit in a way that like open hands, kind of open stance, like don't fold your hands, don't clench your fist, lean over the table and pull your knife out, you know, none of that. Arms crossed and rage. But
whispering under your breath, curses.
Yes. All things that are unhelpful. Dan, one of the stories I did want to tell here, because it was such a cool one, this was recent, but I had the opportunity to visit Brian at the hospital after Alfred was born. And it was really cool because we were in the kind of little, they have like the baby heater, because they're all paranoid about, we need to heat this baby up. Okay. So they put them under, like, I don't know what, it's probably terrible, but they put them under
McDonald's French fry lights.
That's what it is. So little Alfred's heating up. The nurses are talking all around. He started to get a little fussy because they wanted to take his temperature for the 150th time in 5 minutes. And as he did, Brian just leaned down and he said, hey, little guy. He's like, Dad's here. And baby like turns his head completely to Dad, immediately calms down. Like fully, wasn't even responding to the nurses' voices, nothing. I was talking, naturally, doing a lot of talking. And Brian starts talking to his son, and it was like immediately calmed down, turned to look at Dad, and they're just like looking at each other from like 6 inches away. Just such a cool fatherly moment. So it reminded me of something I had written for the Learning Well Homeschool Journal. And in that article, I was talking about, when you look at research, it's pretty clear babies begin recognizing their father's voice in the womb as early as 18 weeks in pregnancy. So when a father's voice is heard regularly throughout the pregnancy, a newborn can recognize it immediately after birth. And one of the studies they do, they just look at the heart rate of the baby. Dad will begin speaking. Immediately the heart rate jumps up. They become, responsive. Mm-hmm. So I think what it points to is a sort of overlooked truth, but it's also obvious that children are hardwired from the moment of conception to respond to their parents' voices, especially that of the father, right? These voices are going to shape their world in nearly every conceivable way. So a father's voice conveys a sense of authority, right? Our voice is a sense of security in our children's life. It brings comfort in times of distress, right? We're reassuring our children when they're racked with anxiety. We're also setting the boundaries of their lives with our words, right? So things like teaching the law, order, rules, moral standards, etc. These are all really powerful things. And I was thinking of Teddy Roosevelt. When he was a boy, he had asthma attacks. And the only thing that they could ever find that would calm him down is his father would hold him and talk to him. Hmm. And as he did that, he would calm down. I couldn't help, Dan, but thinking about the Father. We've talked about this before. The Father's voice over Jesus. This is my son, my beloved son, with whom I am well pleased. And then he sends him out on a mission. It's really interesting to me that before the mission comes, it's communication of love. I love my son. Mm-hmm. So when we think about our sons as arrows, we're sending them out into the world. There has to be this space, like Rocky, where he's like, you're my blood, I love you, you're my son, you can do this. Again, encouragement. So I'm thinking about all this, Dan, and I'm saying, wow, father's voice is very powerful in the home. I wonder if you have any, like, is there anything in your life you can think of that would resonate with that, where you say, like, yeah, you know, the things I've said or the things my father said, or you know of stories like that where just a father's voice has been so powerful?
One thing that immediately comes to mind is reading stories to my children, to my boys.
Interesting.
Just the power of using those stories in influencing their perspective and calling them up to virtue. So I was having a conversation the other day with my eldest boy, and he wasn't being a great brother. He was really picking on his younger brothers. And I talked about the story of St. George and the dragon and about courage and virtue. And there is some lots going on with him, but essentially I was able to use a story, and he knew exactly what I was talking about. He knew exactly what I was talking about, because in the story, you know, it talks about how St. George, he's like this single knight, doesn't know his past. The fairy queen sends him out on this mission, okay, and he's helping these people, meaning he has to sacrifice. I'm sure he was scared of the dragon, and he still ascended to courage and to virtue for the sake of others. And so I was able to tell my boy, listen, if you want to kill the dragon, if you want to be like St. George, you have to think of others and not just merely yourself, because you'll end up being a tyrant and not the hero. And so, I mean, that's just one of many stories, you know, from as far as just reading to your children, just the power of that has been so helpful.
Oh, yeah.
In informing the thoughts of my sons.
Yeah, big time. I mean, I think about even in Plato's Republic, he talks about how if we want to, you know, give culture, transmit culture to our children, one of the key forms of education and formation that we need to rely upon is stories. So you think about the stories we tell in the home and how it shapes the culture. I mean, even the stories that Doug Wilson has told over the years that's inspired our vision of Christendom and postmillennial theology. We talk about the stories of, you know, King Alfred, the stories of even somebody like Arthur Guinness, you know, buying a 9,000-year lease, paying for a 9,000-year lease. Those things actually shape who you become as men. And so I think when you talk about the positive ways a father's words shape, it's like, well, tell great stories, give your kids the stories that will inspire their love and their passion toward the kind of aim you want to aim at. So one of the encouraging things about St. Brennan's is we do, and especially our oldest boys, they do a lot of reading. And that reading is, you know, from the classical Western canon.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that happens is, you know, I was laughing, my youngest the other day, he was talking about, he's reading Marco Polo, and he's just fascinated with the adventure and everything going on. I'm like, well, that's really cool. And then I talked to my oldest son, and he's like, Dad, I hope by the time I'm 18, I'm married and I have a son. And I'm like, okay, that's lofty goals, but okay.
Pump the brakes a little bit.
Pump the brakes. Well, he's almost 16. He's like, I'm going to start 2 businesses, one for the summer, which is landscaping. And then I need something to do during the school year when you don't need to cut grass. And I'm like, well, that's actually interesting. He's like, I need to save money so that I can get a wife. I'm like, okay, cool. But I love it. He goes, I want to name my firstborn son Charlemagne. And I was like, okay. Yes, well, that's awesome. And, you know, you can let your wife know that, and you guys can discuss. But, you know, just really cool that you see how those stories shape what they think is great and beautiful and good and glorious, you know? And so I think that's one way that our words shape the culture. We also, one of the really overlooked things, but we lay down the law, not in a cruel, tyrannical way, but you think about, especially when your kids are young, what do you do more than anything else? Don't do this, don't do that. It's fundamentally like how the Mosaic law works for young children, right? God's actually being merciful by saying, don't do all these things. 10 Commandments are framed in negative fashion.
Yeah.
And so we see that that's wise fatherhood, that your children know where the boundaries are. You consistently enforce those boundaries. Your kids don't have to guess because dad is always consistent in applying the law. That's going to shape a kid's life.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some other ways? I mean, maybe you could talk about the way that a father's voice brings comfort. I'm guessing in some of the injuries that your children have had.
Yeah.
That, you also have to be there to hold and comfort. That's kind of maybe what we didn't get from Mark Driscoll's sermon.
Yeah. Yeah. My boys, they're particularly needy for their father. Anytime one of my boys is crying, they don't want mom. I don't know what's wrong.
Dan, you're just a big, comforting teddy bear.
Maybe.
I mean, I've never got that vibe, but your kids clearly. No, it is actually funny because like Dan will go up. I remember in the past, like you would go up for communion and one of your kids would just freak out.
Yeah. Probably Calvin.
Like, don't leave me, daddy.
Yeah. Don't leave me, dad. Hold me, daddy.
Yes.
I want daddy, crying usually or throwing a fit. But yeah, it is really powerful in a way that I don't think my wife has the same, I guess, effect. My boys, I don't know if it's a security thing or what it is, but there's something really powerful about a father holding a son, father holding a daughter for comfort, because there's so much safety there. It really is a beautiful picture because it's such a scriptural picture as well. And it's within the grain of our nature, to want the embrace of the father, to want the approval of the father, to want the security and comforting of a father is very much so in our nature. And so much of the issues that we have in our society today are because there was no father there to say, don't do that. And when you fail, you can come to me because I will protect you.
Yeah,
I will comfort you.
I think that's great. You think about 2 Corinthians 1. What's said about the Father is he's the Father of all comfort, the God of all mercy.
Yeah.
And so thinking about our fatherhood, is that the way your children view you? Are you their source of mercy and comfort? So often I think dads, we do have this role of like toughening our sons up, especially. But that's not the only side, right? There has to be a point where you're holding your sons, you're comforting them, you're telling them that you love them. It's going to be okay.
Yeah,
I know that.
How can you properly toughen your sons, though, if they don't know you have your back?
Yeah.
They're going to be scared. They're going to become weak.
Because the one thing we don't want them to see and hear from us is you're on your own.
Yeah.
You're going to have to figure it out yourself.
Yeah, good luck.
We want to, be that source of comfort. I also think when you look at the gospel, the Father sending Jesus for this great work of salvation, and the message through the prophets is comfort, comfort my people. Like that's the Father's desire. I would also tie it to something that Doug Wilson has said. I actually heard Luke Jankovic talk about this. But he said, Doug would always say, be the blessing man. Like you're Tom Bombadil in your house. Wherever you go, blessings follow, right? You want to be a good gift giver. You want to have a lot of yeses. You want to be just generous with your time, your energy, your attention. Your kids come home and they want to tell you every single thing that they learned that day. Listen attentively. When they're younger, it's daddy, read that book again. Be attentive. And as you said, but those are the moments when you're going to win your son's hearts.
Yeah.
With your words. It's not the moments where you lose your temper and, who the hell do you think you are? That's not when you win the kids.
No, absolutely not. Especially when you have to lay down the law, you have to balance it. You have to balance it because if it's all law all the time, you become a tyrant and they'll run from you.
Yes.
That you will not win their heart. They will run from you and they will emulate you, and become tyrants themselves.
Yeah, so obviously we want to keep our kids and win their hearts. So I want to kind of wrap this episode up by a reading. This is going to really do all the heavy lifting for an example of how words kill. And we won't over-explain it. But this is from my friend Jacob Pippin. He wrote this a while back. I published it on erichon.com. But I think this is the perfect example of how a father's words can kill and why we need to avoid these types of words. So, Dan, I'm going to ask you to read that for me.
Sure.
This is an excerpt, by the way.
I come from a long line of failed fathers. My parental heritage is one of abandonment, drunkenness, drugs, and jail. My father engrossed himself in crime and vices like his father before him. His grandfather raised him in his home, while his own father laid around in a drug-induced stupor for most of his life. That apple didn't fall from the tree at all, it rotted in place, but one seed was able to fall: me. My father and mother were never married, and I was born out of wedlock. My birth certificate does not bear his name, and he could not be troubled to be there when I came into the world. As a result, I bear my mother's maiden name. Their life was troubled. At times, my father was abusive, physically at some points, but always mentally. He was a master at the art of guilt manipulation. This continued nearly until the day she died of cancer. I was almost 4. She was 26. After my mother's death, a short custody battle ensued between my father and my maternal grandparents. At the time, he was a jobless addict and was spurred on by his grandfather to step up to the plate for his child. The judge gave him an ultimatum: if you want your child, get a job and get sober. It never happened, at least the sobriety part. At that point, my grandparents were awarded temporary guardianship of me. It was never contested again. Throughout my childhood years, I would see him on occasion. He would come to our small church on Sunday evenings, sit in the back pew, and give me a hug and a few bucks. That ended when he got arrested for stealing a case of beer from a 7-Eleven. After that, I saw him maybe once a year on my birthday, but that eventually faded as well. The last time I saw my father in the flesh, I was 16, 18 years ago. I was walking home from a friend's house, kicking up some dust on a dirt road, when I heard the screaming. When I looked up, I noticed my father's blue Chevy pickup truck, parked in front of my grandparents' house. I did not catch the exchanges. He was screaming at them, they in return. It was one of those surreal moments in my life, a moment that didn't feel real. As I made my way up the driveway, he stopped, looked at me, and said, "There's that bastard. Don't you know you're just a bastard?" Those were the last words he ever spoke to me. His voice and those words etched into my mind forever.
Man, I mean, that sucks.
Yeah, that's rough.
Why do you think it's so important for fathers? You know, I was thinking about this in the Psalm. I think it's in the 140s. But one of the psalmist's prayers is, "Set a guard, O Lord, over my lips." One of the things that I'm cognizant of from this story in particular is the need to make sure, gosh, how horrendous to say things like that to people, but we are capable of saying truly horrible things. I'm just curious, that story, Dan, how does it resonate with you?
Well, it's the anti-father because
He's calling him a bastard.
Yes, he's saying, "You're not mine. You are worthless. You are fatherless." Whereas contrasting with the baptism of Christ, as God the Father declares, "This is my son, in whom I am well pleased. He is mine."
It's a stark contrast.
It is the opposite.
So, Dan, if you were going to give, I want to wrap things up with that story in mind. If you were going to give sort of a summary elevator pitch about why do a father's words matter, based on everything that we've talked about, why does it matter that a father's words give life, and how can people, what's the takeaway?
Yeah, well, I think in our culture, we're told over and over again, many different ways by many different people, to stop being the type of man that we've described in the positive, the man who speaks words of life and not words of death. I mean, we've discussed this before, but displays of virtue and courage that would have been celebrated in the past are now classified as toxic. You have in school, in children's entertainment, girls were celebrated at the expense of degrading the value of boyhood and masculinity. And many girls have had positive messages and opportunities. They could be anything that they imagined. But boys were told they're naughty, they need to sit down, they need to play nice with the girls, to the shame of the boys. And in the church, men's sins are punched at, like the relentlessness of Rocky Balboa's face in Rocky movies.
Especially with Drago.
Yeah. Oh man, that guy took a hammering.
Well,
and that's what's happening with like the Mark Driscoll stuff.
You're just taking
with Matt
punches all the
Chandler.
time.
Because it's an acceptable thing. It's because it's some place where in our culture it's permissible to just absolutely put a beat down on men with relentlessness, it becomes accessible for pastors to actually be tough somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't want to paint this picture in summarizing as like men are simply just victims of some matriarchal society or dictatorship, because it's not the case. Men's sins are real. They're prevalent. Men aren't just victims. Men do wicked deeds. They haven't stepped up to take responsibility in this world that's increasingly feminized. But the important thing to remember is that you have the approval of the Father, of God the Father.
Yes.
If you are in Christ, he says to you, you can stand before my throne with confidence, my son. And that's very important to remember. And then to go and do likewise. So when you're interacting with your children, when you are a church father, it's important to say, I am going to have your rod guide, the rod guide and the law guide, and then I'm going to give you comfort and I'm going to give you rest. And so it's important to have that balance and to speak life into your kids' lives.
Yeah, that's great. I think really encouraging, just an encouragement to the guys. Be the Rocky Balboa type father, not the angry pastor, Mark Driscoll, in that clip at least. Be in the corner for your kids and be a voice of encouragement as you point them in the right direction on their God-given mission. Well, Dan, it's been great talking with you in this episode. We want to encourage our listeners, Festinolente, make haste slowly.